conference table at Meridian Food Partners was long and chrome-edged, and it reflected everything back at you, whether you wanted it to or not. The windows looked out over the flat gray rooftops of East Indianapolis. February had stripped the trees to wire. The investors sat in their chairs the way people sit when they know someone is about to be made an example of, and the example had already been chosen before the meeting began. At the head of the table stood Bridget Halsey. She was 31 years old and had been chief executive of Meridian for 8 months. She wore a charcoal blazer and carried herself the way people do when they have recently been written about in a regional business magazine. The feature had called her a disruptor. She had used the word herself several times since. A slide deck glowed on the wall behind her, full of phrases like premium positioning and experience forward and margin acceleration. At the far end of the room stood Quentin Farris. Quentin was 44, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that had spent 20 years carrying sheet pans and stock pots. His dark hair was going gray at the temples. He wore his cleanest work shirt, which was still the kind of shirt that makes finance people uncomfortable. He was not holding a slide deck. He was holding a 3-ring binder he had assembled over 4 weekends, filled with nutritional compliance data, supplier contracts, cost per tray figures, 6 years of written feedback from the nursing homes and VA facilities that Meridian served across central Indiana. He had not been asked to bring it. He had brought it because he understood what the meeting was actually about. Bridget had called it an alignment session. What she meant by it was a verdict. Meridian Food Partners had started under its founder as a contract food service company. The kind that fed people in places fed reliably was not a luxury but a medical necessity. Hospital cafeterias, veterans dining halls, assisted living communities, school lunch programs in 3 counties. The founders had built the company on something unglamorous. The belief that a patient eating a low-sodium lunch in a rehabilitation facility deserved the same care in its preparation as anyone at a white tablecloth restaurant. That belief was the whole foundation. Quentin Farris had worked his way up inside that foundation for 15 years. He started as a prep cook in the company's central kitchen and became, over time, the director of kitchen operations. He knew which produce supplier in Terre Haute ran the most consistent quality, and which one started cutting corners in August when the heat stressed the fields. He knew which dietary codes applied to a patient recovering from cardiac surgery versus a patient in memory care. He knew which kitchen manager at the South Bend facility had a habit of oversalting broths when she was understaffed, and he had worked out a quiet system to catch it before the trays left the line. He knew which delivery route through the east side of the city ran behind on Thursdays, and how to stagger load times to compensate. For 15 years, Meridian had served its clients without a single serious dietary incident on his watch. That record appeared nowhere in Bridget's slide deck. Bridget had arrived with a clear vision. She wanted to turn Meridian into a premium event catering company. She wanted to serve corporate galas, wedding seasons, gallery openings. She wanted the brand associated with candlelit tables and chef's choice menus, not with stainless warming trays and printed dietary restriction labels. In her first 8 months, she had executed that vision with the confidence of someone who had never watched a vision fail. She brought in a creative director from a restaurant group. She redesigned the company's visual identity. She launched a high-end catering division and marketed it aggressively across the Indianapolis metro area. She moved the company's flagship kitchen from the East Side facility to a renovated space downtown, closer to the event venues she intended to serve. And she began cutting what she called legacy costs. The in-house nutrition compliance team, 4 registered dietitians who reviewed every menu before it reached a healthcare client, was reduced to 1. The long-term supplier relationships Quentin had built over years were replaced with a lower-cost regional distributor that had underbid market by 9%. The East Side Commissary, a building the company had operated from for 2 decades, was listed for sale. Bridget described it in the board meeting as a non-core facility, with significant carrying cost. Quentin watched the changes arrive one at a time. He documented each one carefully and said nothing when each was announced, because he understood the politics of the room, and he had a daughter at home who needed his health insurance. Then the dietary errors started. Small at first, a pureed meal delivered to a patient who had been cleared for soft foods, a high-potassium dish flagged by a nursing facility dietitian in Anderson, a sodium count on a cardiac recovery tray that came back 400 milligrams over specification. Each error was explained away by someone higher up. Rounding variance. Vendor mislabeling. A one-time occurrence. Quentin wrote a report. He documented the errors, traced each one back to the staffing reduction on the compliance team, and attached a proposal for a leaner version of the original oversight system that would cost less than the incidents themselves. He sent it to Bridget's office with a cover note that was careful, precise, and used none of the words actually running through his head at the time. Her deputy forwarded it back with a note that said Bridget would address operational concerns at the quarterly review. The quarterly review was the alignment session. Bridget opened by presenting the event catering division's early revenue figures, which were strong. She walked through projections for the next 2 years that assumed continued growth on the premium side and gradual reduction of lower-margin healthcare contracts. The investors leaned forward in the way investors lean when a number confirms what they already hoped. Then she turned to Quentin. She asked him to explain the operational friction in the healthcare division. She used that word, friction. The documented errors, in her framing, were friction. She asked why, with new systems in place, there was still friction coming from his team. Quentin began with the data. He laid out the incidents in chronological order. He connected the compliance team reduction to the error rate with citations. He described the report he had submitted. He was measured and precise, and he used no language anyone could fairly call accusatory. Bridget cut him off in the third paragraph. She did not need to relitigate a report that had already been reviewed, she said. What she needed from operational leadership was a path forward, not a post-mortem. The company was in transition, and the people who could not adapt to a transitioning business model were not the people who would be carrying it into the future. The room went quiet. A sound came from the doorway. Della Farris was 7 years old, with her father's dark eyes and a worn canvas lunch bag hanging from one arm. The school had called a 2-hour delay that morning because of ice on the roads. Quentin had left her with the front desk receptionist before the meeting, with the understanding that someone would keep her occupied. The receptionist had run out of ways to do that. Della stood in the doorway in her blue coat and her snow boots, looking for her father. She found him at the far end of the long chrome table. She did not step inside. Bridget saw her. Something in her expression did not soften. It moved the other direction. She turned back to the room. She said that she had noticed a pattern in certain members of the operational team. She said that the company could not afford managers whose first commitment was somewhere other than the work. There were people in that room. She did not look at Quentin when she said it, which was its own kind of precision, who had demonstrated, consistently, that they were not able to give the company what it required. Then she looked at him. "You're dismissed," she said, "effective today." No one at the table spoke. 2 of the board members studied the surface in front of them. The creative director put his eyes on his phone. Quentin did not respond to her. He looked at his daughter in the doorway. The lunch bag had slipped from Della's arm and was hanging by a single strap from her wrist, about to fall. He closed the binder. He walked the length of the conference table without hurrying. He crouched in front of his daughter and caught the bag before it hit the floor, looped it back gently over her shoulder, held it in place with one hand for a moment. Then he took her other hand and led her out. The drive home took 20 minutes through streets still wet from the morning ice. Quentin kept both hands on the wheel. Della sat in the back seat with the lunch bag in her lap and watched the bare trees and gray sky and fast food signs slide past the window. She had packed the bag herself that morning. She did it most mornings. Inside were 2 sandwiches, one for herself, one for her father, made the way her mother had always made them, with mustard on both sides and the crusts trimmed. Della had learned by watching, and she had kept doing it after there was no one left to learn from. Quentin made grilled cheese for dinner, because it was what she asked for. He stood at the stove and focused on the bread until the color was right, and tried not to think about the binder, sitting in a trash can on the 4th floor of a building he would never have reason to enter again. She ate most of hers, then she set down her fork. "Dad," she said. He looked up. "Are you still a cook?" Later, Quentin would say that he had answered harder questions in his life. He had talked Della through her mother's death when she was 4, in language a 4-year-old could hold without breaking. He thought he was a man who had learned to answer the questions that mattered. This one stopped him cold. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair, so they were at eye level. She was watching him with the patient seriousness children have when they want an honest answer and are old enough to know if they aren't getting one. He did not say anything about Bridget. He did not say anything about the meeting. "Yes," he said. "That's the one thing they don't have the authority to take." She tilted her head. "Then what are you going to do?" He looked at the canvas lunch bag on the counter. It had been his wife Wanda's, years ago. A simple waxed bag with a brass clasp she'd used to bring lunch to him at work when they were young. Before Della came along, before the illness took its time claiming her, he had put the bag in a closet after Wanda died. Della had found it on her own and started using it, and he had left it without comment, because some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. He looked at it a moment longer. "Your mother used to say I could feed anybody," he said. "Rich, poor, sick, well, didn't matter who was at the table. She said the food was the same care either way." He paused. "I think I need to remember what that actually means." Della considered this. Then she picked up her grilled cheese and finished it. After she was asleep, Quentin sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and his laptop. He pulled up the public property records for the East Side Commissary, the address on Addison Street. He had worked in that building for 11 of his 15 years at Meridian. He knew where the hot spots were in the walk-in coolers. He knew which burner on the 6 range ran 15 degrees hot, and why the loading dock door needed a specific 2-handed motion to open without jamming. He knew the building the way you know any place you have fed people from for a long time. He also knew it had been on the market for 6 months without a buyer, because the grease trap needed full replacement, and the ventilation system was 12 years past its last complete inspection. The ask had been lowered twice. He wrote 2 words at the top of the legal pad in block letters: Farris Provisions. He looked at what he had written. Then he wrote the names of every nursing home director, VA program administrator, and school food coordinator he knew personally. People who had shaken his hand after an inspection and meant it. People who had called him directly with a problem because they trusted he would pick up. There were 22 names on the list when he finished. He uncapped a second pen and started writing a business plan in the margins. The next morning he drove to Addison Street before the sun was fully up. The listing agent, a tired-looking man named Gordon Searles, met him at the chain-link gate and did not bother with a rehearsed pitch. He said the roof above the secondary prep area leaked. He said 2 restaurant groups had toured the building and walked out without bidding. He said the grease trap replacement alone was a $10,000 job before the first meal was cooked. Quentin asked him to unlock the door. He walked the building the way he always evaluated a kitchen, methodically, with his hands as much as his eyes. He ran a palm along the range hoods. He checked the floor drains. He tested the walk-in compressor, which shuddered but held pressure. He opened the loading bay doors and gauged the clearance and the staging room, and calculated how many trucks could work the lot at one time. He turned on the prep sink and checked water pressure. He pressed his boot heel against the concrete floor in several places and felt it hold. He was not cataloging what was broken. He already knew what was broken. He was looking for the bones. The bones were good. He told Gordon Searles he would need 2 weeks to arrange financing. He sold the paid-off truck he had been driving for 3 years. He closed a small investment account he had opened when Della was born. Then he drove to the home of Sherman Pratt, who was 63 years old and had run purchasing for Meridian for 19 years. Before Bridget's first wave of cost restructuring eliminated his position, Sherman grew tomatoes in a greenhouse, attached to the back of his house, because he needed something to put his hands into. Sherman listened to Quentin's plan over a cup of coffee, strong enough to resurface a countertop. He didn't offer advice or ask questions while Quentin talked. When Quentin finished, Sherman stood, went to his desk, and came back with a bank envelope from the second drawer. He set it on the table without ceremony. "I was saving that for a boat," he said. "But I'm 63 and I don't actually like being on the water." That was the loan. Quentin's name was the collateral. Sherman also wrote down 2 names: Aurelio Baptista, who had run the cold side station at the Addis Kitchen for 14 years before Bridget's transition, and was now working a catering job he'd described to Sherman as a slow death by canapes, and Pauline Garth, one of the 4 registered dietitians cut from the compliance team, who had taken a hospital staff position, but still answered Quentin's number on her lunch break. Quentin called both of them the next morning. Both said yes before he finished asking. He closed on the property on a Thursday. He brought Della on Saturday. She walked the dim kitchens beside him with one hand trailing along the stainless steel countertops, the way children touch things they are deciding how to feel about. "Is this your new restaurant?" she asked. "Not exactly a restaurant," he said. "More like a kitchen that feeds people who really need it." She thought for a moment. Like Grammy was? Her grandmother had spent the last 2 years of her life in a memory care facility on the north side of the city. "Like Grammy," he said. She looked up at him. "Okay," she said simply, and that was all the blessing he needed. The first 3 weeks at Farris Provisions did not look like a business. They looked like 4 people, and a teenager Aurelio had brought in on weekends, breaking down and resetting a kitchen that hadn't run at full capacity in 8 months. Quentin replaced the grease trap with a plumber he'd used at Meridian. He sourced second-hand equipment from a hotel kitchen closing in Fort Wayne. He rebuilt the prep line layout, based on 2 decades of watching where kitchen workers wasted motion. And then they ran full meal cycles until the workflow stopped fighting itself. Pauline Garth built the compliance system from scratch. Every menu went through her before it was finalized. Every dietary modification was entered into a protocol that could be pulled and audited at any point. Nothing left the building without her sign-off. It was slow and rigorous and exactly the work Meridian had stopped doing. In the 4th week, a produce delivery arrived 60 pounds short on sweet potatoes for a nursing home order in Carmel. Quentin called every contact on his supplier list at 5 in the morning, drove personally to a food warehouse in Greenfield before dawn, and picked up the shortfall himself. The facility received their meal on schedule. No one outside the kitchen ever knew about the drive. 3 days later, a meal container seal failed in transit, and a tray of chicken arrived at a nurse's home compromised. Quentin drove out himself, stood in the facility director's office, explained exactly what had happened, and brought a replacement meal from a cooler in the back of his borrowed van. He did not offer a discount. He offered an apology and a revised seal specification that Aurelio implemented by the following Monday morning. The director was Verna Ogle. She had managed the Pleasant Ridge facility in Carmel for 18 years and had been a Meridian client for 11 of them. When Meridian's new centralized pricing structure rolled out, she had left a voicemail for Quentin the morning after his dismissal. It was the first message he returned after Sherman's. Verna drove to the Addison Street kitchen on a Tuesday in a silver. She parked with precision and walked in from without small talk. Quentin showed her 3 sample meal trays and walked her through the compliance protocol in plain language. She asked 12 specific questions. He answered all 12. She asked for his pricing. He quoted a fair number, 8%, above what she was currently paying Meridian. She wrote him a check for the first month's service on the spot. "I paid for what I got from them," she said, putting the checkbook back in her bag. "And I'll pay for what I get from you. Don't discount what you're worth." Counters. He didn't. Verna mentioned Farris Provisions to a colleague managing a memory care community in Zionsville. That director called on a Wednesday and placed a daily order for 200 meals. She mentioned the new vendor to the administrator overseeing a VA day program in Castleton. The VA administrator sent a compliance questionnaire that Pauline completed and returned in 2 days. They passed every category. The contract was signed on a Friday. Farris Provisions had no advertising budget. It grew by the oldest mechanism in the service industry. People who had been let down telling people they trusted, and those people eventually calling the number they'd been given. Inside Meridian's offices, the numbers began saying what numbers always eventually say. The event catering division was performing, but the healthcare contract renewals were coming in short. 3 facilities had declined to renew. 2 cited compliance response time. 1 cited staffing continuity. Bridget's finance team framed it as expected attrition during brand transition. Then a sales director told Bridget that 2 of the non-renewing facilities had gone to a new vendor on the east side. A small operation just getting started. Farris Provisions. Bridget stopped walking. She said the name again quietly to herself. When her assistant confirmed who ran it, she sat in her office chair and looked at the Indianapolis skyline, without speaking for a long time. The contract that altered everything arrived in early spring. Lakefront Health Partners, a regional healthcare network with 14 facilities across central and southern Indiana, was consolidating its food service operations under a single vendor. The 5-year contract would be the largest in the state's healthcare food service sector. A committee of administrators, clinical dietitians, and financial officers would evaluate through a 2-stage process. Bridget's team prepared the Meridian submission for 3 weeks. The presentation was polished, thorough, and included a full redesign of the service packaging. It was exactly the kind of presentation that performs well when an audience is trying to imagine what they might want. Farris Provisions was added to the short list by the committee's clinical nutrition director, who had come across Pauline Garth's compliance methodology in an industry newsletter and made a call. Quentin arrived at the evaluation meeting with Aurelio, Pauline, and Hillary Strand, a logistics coordinator who had joined the company 4 months earlier. They did not bring a presentation deck. They brought a serving cart. On the cart were 3 complete meal trays prepared to 3 specific dietary profiles the committee had provided in the RFP documents: a cardiac care diet, a renal diet, and a texture-modified diet for patients with diagnosed swallowing difficulties. Each tray was sealed, labeled, and temperature logged. A tablet on the cart displayed the real-time data trail from prep through transport. The committee chair was a careful woman in her late 50s named Dr. Ruth Ibarra. She had run food service compliance across lakefront facilities for 11 years. She had sat through many presentations in that time. She had not been served a meal at one. Quentin set a tray in front of her. He named every ingredient on the cardiac menu, its source, its preparation method, its sodium count. He opened Pauline's compliance binder and walked Dr. Ibarra through the sign-off chain for that exact tray from initial prep through final seal. He explained what happened when a patient's dietary needs changed mid-cycle. Then he showed her. Aurelio pulled a flagged component, substituted the approved alternative, resealed the tray, and relogged the entry. The process took under 3 minutes. The committee leaned forward as one. He laid down a 3-year cost of ownership projection based on their published facility census figures. He walked them through his delivery infrastructure and the route redundancies he had built in. He named his compliance error rate for the previous 8 months, 0 incidents, requiring patient notification. He did not mention Meridian once. He did not need to. One committee member asked why a company less than a year old should be trusted with 14 facilities. Quentin answered evenly and without raising his voice. Because we were built by people who know exactly what happens when these systems fail. We didn't design our process to look correct in a contract review. We designed it around what a patient needs at 6 in the morning, when nobody from the corporate office is watching. Dr. Ibarra asked why he had started the company. He paused before answering. My wife spent the last months of her illness being fed by food service operations that treated nutrition as a logistics problem. Some days the meal was right. Some days it wasn't close. There was no one accountable in between. He looked at the table for a moment. I wanted to be the person accountable in between. 2 hours later, Dr. Ibarra returned with the committee's determination. Farris Provisions would be awarded the first phase contract, covering 6 facilities, with performance milestones at 90 days and 6 months. Pending those milestones, the remaining 8 facilities would follow. Meridian's submission had not been selected. The team was thanked for their time. Bridget was still in the hallway when Quentin came out. She had not left after the committee retired to deliberate. She was standing near the window at the far end of the corridor, with her blazer still buttoned, and her expression arranged into something that was close to composed, but not quite there. When he drew even with her, she spoke. I want to ask you something honest, she said. He stopped and waited. Is this what you wanted, to prove me wrong? Quentin looked at her. He thought about a grilled cheese dinner, and a question from a 7-year-old at a kitchen table. He thought about a canvas bag, with a brass clasp sitting on a countertop. No, he said. I wanted my daughter to grow up watching her father do work he believed in. That's the whole of it. Bridget was quiet. It cost her something visible. He spoke once more, and he kept his voice steady. Meridian had once been a company that families trusted with the people they loved most, the ones who couldn't speak for themselves at the table, who couldn't send food back, who depended entirely on what arrived in front of them. That trust wasn't a legacy asset or a brand attribute. It was the only real thing the company had ever sold. Her father's generation had built it by walking the kitchens every morning, knowing every dietitian's name, answering the phone on Sunday, when a facility director called with a problem. It could be rebuilt, but not from a slide deck and not by deciding that the people who needed the most care were the wrong market. She said nothing. She looked at the corridor floor. He walked back toward where Aurelio and Pauline and Hillary were waiting beside the serving cart. He pressed the elevator button. He did not look back down the hall. Farris Provisions completed the lakefront first phase milestones ahead of schedule. The second phase was approved without committee debate. Quentin hired 6 additional kitchen staff, most of them people who had spent careers in institutional food service and been told that experience wasn't what the industry was looking for anymore. He replaced the walk-in cooler compressor and put a new roof over the loading dock. The old Addison Street building, which 6 months earlier had been a property no one wanted, became a facility that ran 2 shifts and smelled, on good days, like something worth being part of. Meridian Food Partners did not collapse. Bridget, after a long series of board conversations, scaled back the event catering ambitions and restored a clinical nutrition position on the healthcare contracts. The compliance protocol was rebuilt more carefully than the first version had been. Carter, the deputy who had buried Quentin's original report with a single-sentence summary, left the company within the year. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind Bridget's father had likely told her about, somewhere along the way, in a sentence she had heard but not yet understood. One evening in late spring, Quentin brought Della to the Addison Street kitchen after school. The prep team was finishing a late run. Pauline was reviewing the next week's menus at the back desk. Aurelio was singing something in Spanish over the sound of the dish machine. Della sat at the small table in the corner office where she did her homework most afternoons. The same table Quentin had built from salvaged lumber in the first week, when they had money for equipment but not yet for furniture. Under the top of the table on the underside where only someone reaching for the brace would find it, she had taped a piece of paper. It said, in her careful pencil printing, "Dad built this. He had found it the second week and left it exactly where she put it, and he had not moved it since." The canvas lunch bag hung on the back of her chair. After a while she looked up from her homework and watched her father moving through the kitchen, checking the seal line, pressing each container lid with his thumb, the same motion he had used for 20 years in kitchens that had belonged to other people. "Dad," she said, "do you still think about it, what she said, that you were dismissed?" He looked up from the line. He considered it honestly. "Not anymore," he said. She waited, and he said a little more. "When someone tells you that you're finished," he said, "what they usually mean is that they've run out of ways to see what you're worth. That's their limitation, not yours." She looked at him for a moment, then went back to her homework. Outside, the last light of the evening was leaving the loading dock. The kitchen smelled of the soup that had gone out that morning, chicken broth, low sodium, with carrots cut the way the memory care facilities requested them, soft enough to dissolve gently before they needed to be chewed. The smell of it had worked into the walls over the months, the way a kitchen always comes, to carry the character of what it has fed, and who has fed it. Quentin signed off on the next day's menu, pressed his thumb against the last of the seals, and walked back to sit with his daughter while she finished her work. Some people only begin when the rest of the world has decided there is nothing left to start.